The gates of Graceland were closed to the public that night, but the silence inside felt louder than any crowd that had ever gathered beyond them. The world believed it understood Elvis Presley. It believed it understood the rise, the fame, the white jumpsuits glittering beneath stage lights, the shaking hips that scandalized one generation and defined another. It believed it understood the fall, the weight gain, the prescription bottles, the isolation, the headlines that slowly shifted from worship to worry. The story had already been written in newspapers long before his heart stopped beating. The king of rock and roll, a cultural explosion, a tragic ending, clean, contained, explained. But history has a dangerous habit of simplifying men into symbols, and symbols into cautionary tales. Inside Graceland, beneath chandeliers and thick southern air, there lived a version of Elvis that never made it onto a front page, and the only person who carried that version in full was a little girl walking barefoot down those long carpeted hallways. The myth of Elvis was powerful because it was convenient. America loved its legends, bold and dramatic. Born in Tupelo, rising from poverty to superstardom, Elvis became more than a singer. He became a movement. By the time he was selling out Las Vegas residencies and filming Hollywood pictures, he was no longer entirely human in the public imagination. He was spectacle. He was excess. He was larger than life. And when larger-than-life figures stumble, the world watches with a strange mixture of fascination and inevitability. The narrative shifted slowly in the 1970s. The camera angles changed. The tabloid language sharpened. Words like decline and self-destruction began circling his name. It was as though the world had decided that if it had built the crown, it also had the right to narrate the collapse. But inside Graceland, the collapse did not look like headlines. It looked like exhaustion. It looked like pressure. It looked like a father trying to balance a kingdom that never slept. Lisa Marie Presley was born into that kingdom. She did not inherit normalcy. She inherited myth. To the outside world, she was the daughter of the king. To him, she was something far more grounding, something real. While photographers camped outside gates and fans screamed at concert arenas, Lisa saw the quiet spaces in between. She saw the early mornings when the house felt still, and her father sat alone with his thoughts. She saw the late nights when music drifted softly through rooms not meant for audiences. She saw the way security guards stiffened at every unexpected sound, and how her father sometimes laughed to cut to the tension. There were rooms in Graceland the public would later tour with reverence, but to her they were simply home. A home that often felt guarded, almost fragile, as if the walls themselves understood how much pressure pressed against them from the outside world. The public image of Elvis in those final years was painted in extremes. Either he was still the untouchable icon, or he was a man spiraling beyond control. There was rarely space for complexity, rarely space for tenderness. But tenderness existed. It lived in small gestures, a hand resting gently on his daughter's shoulder, a playful grin that flashed when she said something clever, the softness in his voice when he asked about her day. Those moments did not erase his struggles. They did not cancel the weight of addiction rumors or the physical toll of relentless touring, but they complicated the picture. And complexity is uncomfortable for audiences that prefer clear heroes or clear tragedies. To Lisa, her father was neither myth nor morality lesson. He was present, imperfect, loving, sometimes distant, sometimes intensely attentive, but always human. Graceland itself felt like a character in this unfolding drama. To fans, it was a palace. To critics, it was a symbol of excess. To a child, it was a maze of echoes. The thick carpets muffled footsteps, but they could not muffle tension. Conversations sometimes stopped when she entered a room. Adults exchanged looks heavy with things she could not yet understand. There were doctors who came and went. There were schedules that shifted suddenly. There were days when her father seemed invincible, full of energy and laughter. And there were days when he seemed tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, a tiredness that settled behind his eyes. The world would later call it decline, but decline is a word that feels clinical, almost attached. What she saw was a man carrying more weight than applause could ever lighten. Fame is not just attention, it is expectation. By the 1970s, Elvis was not merely performing songs. He was performing an identity the world demanded him to maintain. The jumpsuits grew more elaborate, the entrances more dramatic, the crowds louder. And somewhere in that cycle, the line between man and monument blurred.
When he stepped onto a stage, thousands saw a legend. When he stepped off, a little girl saw her father. That transition from deity to dad happened in seconds, yet it required an emotional shift few could understand. The pressure to remain Elvis Presley never paused. Even at home, even in private. The myth lingered like a shadow that refused to detach. There were nights when music filled the house, not for an audience, but for release. Elvis would sit at the piano, fingers moving almost absent-mindedly, melodies drifting through dimly lit rooms. In those moments, the spectacle dissolved. There were no flashing bulbs, no screaming fans, just notes, memory, and breath. Lisa sometimes listened quietly, absorbing something she would only later recognize as vulnerability. The world interpreted his later years through grainy performance footage and sensational headlines, but she remembered something softer: the pauses between songs, the sighs, the way his shoulders slumped when she thought no one was watching. That is the version history rarely archives. Outside the gates, narratives hardened. Reporters speculated, commentators dissected. Every pound gained, every postponed show, every rumor became evidence in a story already leaning towards tragedy. It is easier to analyze a symbol than to understand a man. And yet, inside those guarded walls, the story was still unfolding in real time. It was not a headline. It was daily life, complicated, unpredictable, sometimes joyful, sometimes heavy. For Lisa, the myth did not protect her from confusion. It amplified it. How could the man who carried her, who laughed with her, who asked if she felt safe at night, be the same figure described as unraveling beyond repair? The answer lies in the uncomfortable truth that both versions can exist at once. A legend can be exhausted. A superstar can be overwhelmed. A father can be flawed. But once the public chooses its preferred narrative, reversing it becomes almost impossible. That is where the tension begins, because while the world believed it knew Elvis Presley, the icon, the excess, the fall, there was a witness growing up within those walls who saw a fuller picture. She did not yet have the language to challenge the myth. She did not yet have the platform, but she had memory. And memory, unlike headlines, does not flatten a person into caricature. Part 1 is not about denying the struggles that surrounded Elvis in his final years. It is about widening the frame. It is about stepping past the stage lights and into the hallway where a child watched the myth dissolve into humanity every single day. The world crowned him. The world critiqued him. The world mourned him. But inside Graceland, before the final chapter was written, there lived a quieter truth, one carried not by critics or historians, but by a daughter who would one day realize that the story everyone thought they knew was missing its most intimate perspective. And when that perspective finally begins to speak, the legend will never look quite the same again.
The myth outside the gates was growing louder in the 1970s. Critics whispered that he was no longer the unstoppable force he once was. Concert footage circulated with more scrutiny than celebration. Every performance became evidence, either proof that the king still ruled, or proof that the crown was slipping. But Lisa did not watch him through that lens. She watched him through doorways, through half-open study doors where he sat reading, through the crack of a rehearsal room where music blared louder than necessary, as if volume could drown out doubt. Sometimes he would call her into the music room. "Come here, baby," he would say, his voice softer than the booming baritone fans expected. He would sit at the piano, fingers resting on the keys before pressing down slowly, thoughtfully. The melodies were not always rehearsed showpieces. Sometimes they were gospel fragments, sometimes unfinished thoughts in musical form. She would sit nearby, absorbing it without understanding that she was witnessing something rare. Elvis without performance, Elvis without armor. In those rooms, there were no bodyguards, no audience, no applause required. Just sound and breath, and a father sharing space with his daughter. But the house had other moods too. There were days when doors stayed closed longer than usual, days when the air felt heavy and conversations turned serious. Lisa sensed shifts before she understood them. Children are intuitive that way. She could feel when the staff avoided eye contact, when her father's laughter came slower, when fatigue lingered behind his smile. The world would later describe those years with clinical detachment, health decline, prescription dependency, professional pressure. But inside the house, those realities were less analytical and more emotional. They showed up as silence, as short tempers quickly followed by apologies, as long nights that stretched into mornings. What made it more confusing was that the outside world refused to see nuance. To fans, he remained a hero frozen in eternal charisma.
To critics, he was becoming a cautionary tale. There was no middle ground, no space for contradiction. But Lisa lived in the contradiction daily. She saw strength and vulnerability coexist. She saw a man who could command a stage in front of thousands, yet struggle to command rest for himself. She saw someone deeply aware of expectation. Fame, she would later realize, is not just about being seen. It is about being watched constantly and judged for every fluctuation. Security was constant. The gates were never simply decorative. Guards rotated shifts. Vehicles were monitored. Even as a child, she understood there were boundaries she could not cross alone. It created a strange duality: immense freedom within the property, absolute restriction beyond it. She could explore rooms, hallways, and gardens freely, but the outside world remained distant, almost abstract. The irony was sharp. Millions felt intimately connected to Elvis Presley, yet his own daughter lived in a controlled orbit designed to keep that intimacy from becoming intrusion. There were nights when he returned from tour visibly drained. The stage lights that once energized him now seemed to extract something in return. He would hug her tightly, sometimes longer than usual. In those embraces, there was gratitude, but also something else, a kind of grounding, as if holding his daughter reminded him who he was beneath the costume, beneath the legend. The world saw jumpsuits embroidered with gold. She saw the imprint they left on his shoulders when he took them off. And still, the myth outside continued to harden. Tabloids speculated freely. Commentators dissected his weight, his voice, his movements. Every public appearance became part of a narrative leaning toward inevitability. It is easier for the public to predict tragedy than to acknowledge complexity. But inside Graceland, life did not feel inevitable. It felt uncertain, unpredictable. Some days brimmed with music and energy. Others carried tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface, like a warning no one could fully interpret. Lisa did not yet understand legacy. She did not yet grasp that she was growing up inside a story the world would one day retell endlessly. All she knew was that her father was both adored and scrutinized beyond measure. She sensed that something about that imbalance was unfair. The applause was thunderous, but so was the criticism. The admiration was global, but so was the judgment. And somewhere between those extremes stood a man trying to remain intact. What the cameras never captured were the quieter reassurances, the small questions he asked her. You okay? You having fun? He seemed to need those answers, needed confirmation that at least one part of his world was stable. The myth said he was consumed by ego, but the child watching him saw something closer to concern. The myth said he was unreachable.
But she could walk into his room and sit beside him without ceremony. As the decade progressed, the distance between public perception and private reality widened. Each headline built a sharper outline of decline. Each whisper amplified doubt. And yet inside the mansion, father and daughter continued their fragile rhythm. Moments of joy, moments of tension, moments of ordinary life unfolding beneath extraordinary circumstances. She did not know that these memories would one day become evidence against a simplified narrative. She did not know that she would grow up to challenge the story everyone thought was settled. But even then, in those hallways lined with framed gold records, something was forming quietly within her, a separate archive, an internal record of laughter, exhaustion, tenderness, contradiction. The world was documenting the legend in real time. She was documenting the man, and those two records were not the same. As pressure mounted outside the gates, the contrast sharpened. The myth was growing louder. The private truth was growing heavier. And somewhere between those forces, a child was beginning to understand that one day she might be the only person capable of telling the difference. By the time the outside world began speaking of decline as if it were destiny, something quieter was happening inside Graceland. The rooms had not changed. The chandeliers still reflected gold light against polished surfaces. The piano still stood ready in the music room. The gates still held back crowds. But the emotional temperature of the house had shifted. Lisa Marie was old enough now to sense patterns, old enough to recognize that when her father grew especially quiet, something weighed on him that applause could not fix. Fame had once seemed like armor. Now it looked more like gravity. There were evenings when Elvis would sit alone longer than usual, television flickering without his attention truly on it. The house staff learned to read his moods carefully. Some nights he wanted company, music loud, friends laughing, energy filling the space to push back against an invisible pressure. Other nights he withdrew, retreating into thought. Lisa would sometimes hover near the doorway, unsure whether to step in or wait, and often he would look up and gesture gently. Come here, baby. It wasn't command, it was invitation. In those moments, the king disappeared entirely. He did not speak to her about contracts or critics or box office numbers. He did not dissect reviews.
but he spoke in fragments that revealed more than headlines ever could. He worried about time, about how quickly things changed, about how hard it was to remain the same man the world expected year after year. People don't want you to grow, he once implied in a tone more reflective than bitter. They want you frozen. Lisa did not fully understand, but she sensed the truth in it. The world loved him most when he matched its memory. Music remained his safest language. Late at night, he would return to gospel songs, the kind that connected him to childhood and church pews and something simpler than stardom. His voice softened during those sessions. It carried weight, but also longing. Lisa would sit quietly, sometimes leaning against the piano bench. Those moments felt sacred, not because of celebrity, but because of vulnerability. The myth outside painted him as excessive, indulgent, unraveling. But here, stripped of stage lights, he looked like a man searching for steadiness. Pressure did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came disguised as expectation. Tour dates stacked close together, phone calls about appearances, decisions that had financial consequences far beyond personal comfort. Even as a child, Lisa sensed the rhythm of demand. There was always another show, another commitment, another reason he could not fully rest. When he returned from performing, the energy shift was immediate. He carried adrenaline back into the house, but beneath it lay exhaustion so deep it bordered on something spiritual. Applause could lift him temporarily, it could not restore him completely. There were whispers too, adult conversations carried out in lower tones. Doctors mentioned more frequently. Schedules adjusted around health in ways that were never fully explained to her. Lisa did not know terminology. She did not know diagnosis. She only knew that sometimes her father seemed to move carefully, as if protecting himself from his own body. And yet when he stepped onto a stage, vulnerability vanished behind charisma so powerful it almost defied reality. The contrast was dizzying. To watch a man command thousands one night and struggle for balance the next morning was to witness contradiction in its rawest form. What unsettled her most was how certain the outside world seemed about him. Television commentators spoke with confidence about causes and consequences. Tabloids printed narratives with neat conclusions.
There was something unnerving about strangers speaking as if they possessed the full truth. She knew instinctively that they did not. They had footage, they had speculation, they had access to image, but they did not have access to the quiet hours, to the apologies he made when he felt he had been too short-tempered, to the way he checked on her before going to bed, even when he looked barely awake himself. There was one night that lingered in her memory more sharply than others. The house had been unusually still. No guests, no music filling the halls. She found him in the study, lights dim, seated in near darkness. For a moment, he did not notice her. His posture was not regal. It was heavy. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of surprise, followed by softness. She walked in without speaking and sat beside him. Silence stretched between them, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt honest. After a while, he placed his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, but it carried something deeper, perhaps reassurance for both of them. In that silence, Lisa sensed something she would only later name: fear. Not fear of failure exactly, not fear of criticism, but fear of losing control over the narrative of his own life. Fame had given him extraordinary power. It had also taken away privacy, spontaneity, and the freedom to evolve without scrutiny. The world wanted consistency. It wanted the Elvis it remembered from its youth. But years pass, bodies change, energy shifts, expectations remain fixed. That imbalance creates tension impossible to ignore. And yet, even amid that tension, he remained protective of her innocence. He shielded her from adult complications as much as possible. He laughed louder when she entered a room heavy with discussion. He changed the subject. He asked about her interests. He made space for normalcy within abnormal circumstances. It was as if he were determined that at least one part of his world would not be swallowed by myth. As 1977 approached, the atmosphere inside Graceland grew harder to read. There were good days, days when he seemed energized, hopeful, even playful. And there were days when fatigue etched itself into his movements. Lisa felt the unpredictability without understanding its trajectory. Children live in the present. They do not calculate endings. But she could sense that something about the rhythm of life was becoming more fragile. The laughter did not ring as long. The silences stretched further. The outside world continued building its version of events. Concert reviews became more analytical. Public appearances were scrutinized for signs. It was as if everyone were waiting for confirmation of a story already assumed. Inside the mansion, however, life remained complex and human. He still asked her if she felt safe, still made sure she knew she was loved, still sat at the piano when words felt insufficient. Part 3 is not the fall, it is the tension before it, the space where myth and reality press against each other with increasing force. The world thought it could see the ending forming, but inside Graceland,
a daughter still saw a possibility, still saw a man who, despite exhaustion and pressure, tried to remain present. That duality, public certainty versus private contradiction, would become the foundation of everything she would later defend. Because when the inevitable moment came, when headlines froze his story into permanent tragedy, the world would remember performance clips and tabloid language. Lisa would remember the hand over hers in a dimly lit study, the late-night gospel melodies, the apologies, the protective questions, and those memories would not align neatly with the narrative history chose. The tension was building, the myth was solidifying, but inside those walls, a quieter truth was still breathing, unrecorded, unedited, waiting for the day it would have to stand against the version everyone else believed was complete. August 16, 1977 did not begin as history. It began like any other humid Memphis morning, thick air pressing against the windows of Graceland, the house still wrapped in that strange early quiet before movement starts. There were no headlines yet, no radio interruptions, no crowds gathering beyond the gates. Inside, life existed in fragments, footsteps in hallways, doors opening and closing, the low murmur of routine. But something about that morning felt different, even before anyone could name why. The tension that had been quietly building for months seemed to settle heavily into the walls, as if the house itself understood what the day would demand. Lisa Marie did not wake expecting the world to change. She woke into the same mansion she had always known, the same carpets beneath her feet, the same filtered light through heavy curtains. Childhood does not anticipate catastrophe. It trusts continuity. Yet within hours, continuity would shatter. Adults began moving faster than usual.
Direct narration. Voices carried a sharper edge. There are moments when energy shifts so abruptly that even a child feels it in her chest before she understands it in her mind. This was one of those moments. Somewhere inside the house, urgency replaced routine. A door closed too quickly. A call was made. Footsteps hurried down the hallway. The rhythm of the morning fractured into confusion. Lisa sensed that something was wrong, but the details remained just beyond reach. No one explained. No one paused long enough to translate adult fear into words she could hold. She only saw expressions she had never seen before, tight, pale, focused on something larger than explanation. History would later document the sequence clinically: time of discovery, emergency response, official statements. But inside Graceland, it did not unfold like a timeline. It unfolded like chaos, like sound without structure, like adults trying to maintain control while losing it. Lisa remembered fragments, tones of voice, the echo of hurried movement, the way the house felt suddenly unfamiliar. The same walls that had once protected now felt hollow. When the confirmation came, it did not arrive gently. It arrived as absence, as the sudden realization that the center of her world had vanished. Elvis Presley, the legend, the icon, the king, was declared gone. But to a 9-year-old girl inside that house, it was not a cultural earthquake. It was the disappearance of her father, the man who asked if she was okay, the man who played piano at night, the man who carried exhaustion behind his smile, but still made space for her laughter. Outside the gates, news spread with ruthless speed. Radio stations interrupted programming, television anchors adjusted tone, fans began gathering before official announcements even settled. Within hours, the private tragedy inside Graceland transformed into global shock. Crowds pressed against iron bars, flowers appeared, cameras multiplied. The world mourned loudly, but inside, grief felt disorienting and small. Not small in intensity, but small in scale. It lived in a single child's confusion rather than a nation's spectacle. Lisa remembered wanting clarity, wanting someone to say something that made sense. But grief rarely offers logic. It offers silence. It offers unanswered questions that echo longer than explanations. She had sensed fragility in the months before. She had noticed exhaustion, but she had not calculated finality. No one had sat her down and said, "This could end." Childhood assumes tomorrow. August 16th stripped that assumption away. As the day unfolded, Graceland transformed rapidly. What had been home became memorial. What had been private became public ground. Strangers cried at the gates for a man they felt they knew intimately, and in some ways they did. His music had entered their lives, shaped their memories, defined eras. But the intimacy was one-directional. They knew the performer. They knew the myth. They did not know the quiet study, the late-night gospel sessions, the protective questions, the apologies whispered after short tempers. That version of Elvis disappeared without cameras recording it.
Inside the mansion, adults spoke in logistical language: arrangements, statements, coordination. Lisa heard pieces of it, but processed none of it fully. Grief at that age does not move linearly. It comes in waves of disbelief, in moments where you expect a familiar voice to call your name, only to meet silence instead. The world outside cried for the king. She cried for her dad. Those are not the same grief, even when they share the same name. The public narrative began forming almost immediately. Speculations circled around health, prescriptions, pressure. Commentators spoke with authority. The story hardened quickly into tragedy framed by inevitability. But inevitability is something adults create in hindsight. In the days before, life had still felt open-ended. There had been plans, conversations, music. No one inside that house had walked through the halls thinking, this is the final chapter. Yet within hours, the world spoke as if it had been obvious all along. The funeral preparations intensified the surreal nature of it all. The same property that once held laughter and routine now held ceremony. The gates that once protected privacy now framed mourning crowds stretching beyond sight. Lisa watched adults navigate logistics with solemn precision. She saw strength where there was likely shock. She felt the weight of attention pressing even harder than before. Fame did not disappear with him, it expanded. His death magnified what his life had already made enormous. And amid that expansion, a child's grief risked being overshadowed by spectacle. The cameras did not capture her internal questions. They did not record the private moments where she tried to reconcile memory with finality. They did not film the way silence settled differently in rooms that once held his voice.
To the world, August 16th was the end of an era. To her, it was the beginning of a lifelong negotiation between myth and memory. Because from that day forward, every mention of Elvis Presley would carry two meanings. The public one, icon, tragedy, cultural giant, and the private one, father, flawed and tender, overwhelmed and protective. The tension between those meanings would define her life in ways she could not yet understand. Grief would evolve into defense. Silence would eventually turn into testimony. But on that day, there was only loss. Part 4 is not just about death. It is about rupture, the moment when a global narrative collides violently with personal reality, when the world claims ownership of a story that feels deeply, painfully intimate. Everyone believed they knew Elvis. On August 16th, they mourned him as their king. But inside Graceland, a little girl stood at the center of the storm, holding memories no headline could summarize. And in that collision between spectacle and sorrow, the foundation was laid for the day she would begin to prove that the story the world settled on was incomplete. Grief does not end when the funeral does. It changes shape. In the weeks after August 16th, Graceland felt less like a home and more like an echo. The crowds outside never truly disappeared. Flowers wilted and were replaced. Candles burned down and were relit. Tour buses slowed near the gates as if proximity alone could bridge absence. The world had turned Elvis Presley into eternal memory almost overnight. But for Lisa Marie, eternity felt heavier than comforting. Because memory in public is polished. Memory in private is raw. In the years that followed, she grew up beneath the weight of a name that was no longer simply her father's. It was history's. Every interview request, every documentary, every commemorative special reinforced a single narrative: the king who rose, dazzled, and fell. It was clean, dramatic, marketable, but it was incomplete. And the older she became, the more that incompleteness began to disturb her, not because it denied his struggles, but because it erased his humanity. As a teenager, she learned quickly that silence was safer. The world did not want complexity, it wanted confirmation. If she spoke lovingly about him, critics accused her of denial. If she acknowledged his flaws, fans accused her of betrayal. There was no neutral ground. She was not just a daughter grieving a father. She was the living extension of a legend. Every word she chose carried symbolic weight. So for a long time, she chose caution. But silence has limits, especially when it protects a narrative that feels unbalanced. As she stepped into adulthood, interviews became less avoidable. Questions sharpened. Was he really that isolated? Was he out of control? Did he see the end coming? Each inquiry assumed a version of Elvis already defined by decline. And each time she answered, she felt the tension between honoring truth and defending dignity. She did not deny the reality of his health struggles. She did not pretend the final years were easy, but she refused to reduce him to them. There were moments when her voice carried quiet defiance, not loud, not confrontational, but firm.
She spoke about tenderness, about humor, about protectiveness. She reminded audiences that the man who filled arenas also tucked his daughter into bed, that the voice which shook stadiums also whispered reassurance in hallways. The public narrative framed him as consumed by excess. She framed him as consumed by expectation. Those are not identical conditions. Reclaiming nuance is not glamorous work. It does not trend like scandal. It does not generate headlines like controversy. But it shifts perspective slowly, almost invisibly. Over time, listeners began to hear something different in her tone. Not denial, not idolization, but balance. She acknowledged the prescriptions, the exhaustion, the toll of relentless touring. Yet she placed those realities within context. Fame at that magnitude distorts ordinary coping mechanisms. The world demanded perfection from someone who had begun as a young man with a guitar and a dream. When perfection inevitably cracked, critics treated it as moral failure rather than human strain. Lisa's defense was never about rewriting facts. It was about widening the frame. She did not argue that he was invincible. She argued that he was overwhelmed. She did not claim he was flawless. She claimed he was loving. Those distinctions matter, because once a narrative solidifies, especially around a public figure, it becomes difficult to inject empathy into it. Tragedy sells easily than tenderness. Graceland, too, transformed in ways that mirrored this struggle. What had once been her home became a destination, a pilgrimage site for millions. Walking through its rooms as an adult felt surreal. Tour guides described spaces she once navigated barefoot. Visitors listened with reverence to curated stories.
The house no longer belonged solely to memory. It belonged to legacy. And legacy, she realized, is not passive. It requires stewardship. There were days when she felt protective of the estate, not as property, but as narrative territory. Every exhibit, every archived costume, every recorded song contributed to how future generations would understand Elvis Presley. If the emphasis leaned too heavily towards spectacle, the man risked disappearing entirely. If it leaned too heavily toward decline, the joy risked being forgotten. Balance became her quiet mission. Yet, even as she worked to preserve that balance publicly, privately, she wrestled with her own grief. Defending someone's humanity does not erase personal loss. It can even intensify it, because each retelling forces you to revisit moments you would sometimes rather keep untouched. Interviews reopened rooms in her memory, the dim study, the late-night piano melodies, the protective questions. The world saw a cultural phenomenon. She saw a father navigating pressure in ways that were not always sustainable. There were critics who argued that time should not soften judgment, that history must remain unfiltered. But history without empathy becomes caricature, and caricature cannot hold truth. Lisa's gradual willingness to speak was not about romanticizing the past. It was about resisting oversimplification. She understood something the public did not, that myth is easier to manage than contradiction, but contradiction is where real people live. As anniversaries passed, 5 years, 10 years, 20, the public remembrance settled into ritual. Documentaries replayed familiar footage, commentators recycled familiar analysis. Yet in interviews, she continued inserting subtle recalibrations, small reminders, a story about him laughing uncontrollably, a detail about how seriously he took fatherhood, a memory that disrupted the one-dimensional image of excess. None of it erased tragedy, but it prevented tragedy from being the only lens. Part 5 is where silence turns into measured voice, where grief evolves into responsibility, where a daughter begins to understand that memory can either be surrendered to public convenience or guarded with intention. Everyone thought they knew Elvis. They knew the jumpsuits, the stage entrances, the final headlines. But Lisa knew the contradictions. And instead of allowing those contradictions to be flattened, she chose, carefully, sometimes painfully, to let them breathe. Because in the end, defending someone's humanity is not about denial. It is about refusing to let their lowest moments define their entire existence. And as she stepped more confidently into that role, the narrative around Elvis Presley began, however slightly, to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that future listeners might pause before accepting the simplest version of the story. Enough that the legend would carry not only spectacle and sorrow, but also complexity, tenderness, and the quiet truth of a daughter who had seen him without the crown. Legacy is not something that settles quietly. It moves. It shifts with every generation that touches it. By the time decades had passed since that August morning,
Elvis Presley no longer existed only in grainy footage or vinyl records. He existed in documentaries, biopics, museum exhibits, streaming platforms, Halloween costumes, impersonators, and anniversary specials. The king had become permanent, immortal in a way that few artists ever achieve. But immortality has a cost. It freezes a person in time. It turns a life into an emblem, and emblems rarely allow room for contradiction. Lisa Marie understood that better than anyone. Graceland was no longer just the house where she grew up. It was one of the most visited private homes in America. Tourists walked through rooms that once held her childhood. They paused at the piano, they studied framed photographs, they lowered their voices near the meditation garden. For them, it was sacred ground. For her, it was layered ground. Every polished surface held two realities, public reverence and private memory. She could never experience one without feeling the other. As years passed, something subtle began to happen. The sharpness of the decline narrative softened in popular culture. New generations discovered Elvis through music first, not headlines. They heard the voice before they heard the controversy. They saw charisma before they saw cautionary tales. And in that shift, Lisa's steady defense of nuance began to matter more. She had never tried to erase history. She had tried to humanize it. And humanization takes time to root. There were moments when she spoke openly about the burden of carrying his name, not as complaint, but as acknowledgement. Being the daughter of Elvis Presley meant inheriting both adoration and scrutiny. Every career move she made was compared, every artistic choice measured against a legend.
But she never attempted to replicate him. She never tried to wear the crown. In many ways, that refusal was its own statement. She was not preserving a myth. She was preserving a man. When she described him in later interviews, her tone carried something steady, not defensive, not romanticized, grounded. She spoke of love, of intensity, of complexity. She admitted the flaws without allowing them to dominate the story, and that balance began influencing how others spoke about him too. Journalists asked more layered questions. Documentaries explored emotional dimensions rather than just medical ones. The narrative did not flip overnight, but it widened. That widening is the real reversal. For decades, the dominant frame around Elvis had been spectacle followed by collapse, rise and fall, crown and consequence. It was dramatic, symmetrical, almost mythic in structure. But real lives are rarely that symmetrical. By insisting on emotional context, on fatherhood, vulnerability, exhaustion, expectation, Lisa disrupted that tidy arc. She reminded the world that cultural giants are still human beings, shaped by pressure, fear, devotion, and love. And then, as time moved forward with its own relentless rhythm, another layer of grief entered the story. When Lisa Marie Presley herself passed away in 2023, public mourning resurfaced in waves. But this time, something felt different in the coverage. Conversations about Elvis carried more softness, more awareness of generational weight. People revisited her interviews, re-listened to her reflections, and in doing so, they encountered Elvis not just as icon, but as father. That shift was not accidental. It was the result of years of careful testimony. In the end, she did not dismantle the legend. She reframed it. She allowed space for contradiction, the jumpsuits and gospel hymns, the stadiums and the study room, the applause and the exhaustion, the myth and the man. By holding both, she proved something powerful, that protecting someone's humanity does not weaken their legacy, it deepens it. Walk through Graceland today, and you will still see the spectacle, the gold records, the costumes, the photographs frozen in time. But if you listen closely, beyond the guided tour script, beyond the curated displays, you might sense something quieter beneath it all, a daughter's memory layered into the walls, a private truth coexisting with public myth. Everyone thought they knew Elvis. They knew the voice that shook the world. They knew the headlines that followed. They knew the tragedy that closed the chapter. But very few knew the man who asked his daughter if she felt safe at night. Very few knew the hand resting gently over hers in a dimly lit room. Very few knew the exhaustion behind the charisma. Lisa Marie knew, and because she chose, slowly and carefully, to share that knowledge, the legend can no longer exist in only one dimension. The crown remains, the music endures, the cultural impact is unquestioned. But now, woven into that permanence is something softer and more enduring than myth, humanity. That is the final reversal. Not scandal, not revelation, but perspective. The world crowned him king. History called him tragic. But a daughter proved he was human.